Hi, welcome to Adamsaurus Music Review, where we talk about more music no one cares about. I'm Adamsaurus, and today we're actually going to have more of what I would call an Adamsaurus music discussion. And please feel free to comment down below on this. Uh, this actually might be a video a lot of you care about, despite my normal tagline. Welcome, like I said, to the first edition of Adamsaurus Discusses. This week we're going to be a video that I've been wanting to make for a while. We're going to be discussing my declining interest in the band Underoath over the years, which might sound weird, but the reason I decided to do this video is mostly because over the last few months I've been listening to the more recent albums by some of my favorite bands like Norma Jean, Demon Hunter, and Emery, and I realized I've liked all those bands since high school. But you know what else I loved back then? Lucio Fulci! But this isn't about Italian horror movies, but I do like Italian horror movies, so... Anyway, this is about music, and I loved Underoath back then. From about 2004 and 2008, their albums, They're Only Chasing Safety and Define the Great Line, were in constant rotation from about their release up until around 2008. But shortly after the release of Lost in the Sound of Separation, their 2008 album, I kind of lost interest in the band, and fast forward 2 years when Disambiguation came out in 2010, that was a very meh record for me. And I've decided to take that time to discuss those albums and maybe get some feedback in the comments from you guys. Tell me what you think. I'm going to be discussing the 4 albums from 2004 to 2008, and I'm going to be discussing 3 different aspects. There is the music and lyrical aspect, what genre they fit into the most, and how it's evolved from the previous album. The impact on the music scene as a whole, which is more opinion and conjecture to an extent, because I was there for some of this, some of it I was outside of the scene just due to medical issues I was having at that time, and my personal experience and feelings towards those albums. Keep in mind, this is all my opinion for the most part, and feel free to disagree with me, but be polite about it. And also keep in mind, I will not be going over any Underoath albums before 2004, so no, nothing from Active Depression, Cries of the Past, and for the most part we're going to be staying away from the Changing of Times, but I will be discussing it a little bit when comparing it to They're Only Chasing Safety. Alright? Alright. Oh, and I'm also not going to be talking about their most current album, Erase Me. I did a full video on that. It's on this channel. Go take a look at it if you want my opinion on that album. Alright, They're Only Chasing Safety. This album was a major progression for Underoath, in my opinion, and as several of the mainline members were changed out, including the vocalist. While the previous album, Changing of Times, was rooted in a more of a post-hardcore sound with the heavier elements from their previous 2 albums, Cries of the Past and Active Depression, still there, but reduced, especially noticeable on songs such as Message for Adrian. But like I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. Look into that for itself. This album went in a slightly lighter, more poppy direction, with the heaviest song being I Don't Feel Very Receptive Today. And the album, it had more in common sound-wise, I think, with Glassjar, The Hurt Process, or Thrice, than the more metalcore and almost black metal influenced sound of the previous 3 albums, which I admit on Changing of Times was a reduced influence, but it was still there. The vocals and lyrics are fine, if not groundbreaking. Are fine, if not exactly groundbreaking. The last track being more of a Christian worshipy kind of song that's still kind of vague with its lyrics. The album's more pop and alternative rock influences come through, and the added melody and hooks adds a lot of catchy hooks on songs such as Reinventing Your Exit, Boy Brushed Red, Living in Black and White, and I'm Content with Losing. All great. Overall, the album was very memorable and very enjoyable because of the more pop influence, I would say. As far as its influence on the scene overall, this is the album that catapulted Underoath into the spotlights in the early post-hardcore scene. And really, in my opinion, I think this album holds up very well for its time, and the emo influence isn't as prevalent as it is on their contemporaries like Emery, The Used, Hawthorne Heights, and the album's a lot more upbeat in its tone for the majority of the album. Around the time, around that time, I think a lot of bands that had the singing screaming combo thing going uh, kind of were more in a melancholy. And I'm not saying this was like a happy-go-lucky album, but I feel like the melancholy wasn't quite as profound. You can disagree with me on that if you want, but that's how I've always felt about this. Um, and I feel like a lot, while the whole poppy, screaming, and singing combo thing was there before, I feel like this really kind of pushed that more into the main, like that was what people wanted to do. I'm sure there are other albums that were responsible for that influence, but that to me was the album that kind of I noticed a lot of stuff kind of ripping that off after it came out. Um, for me personally, this was one of the first heavy albums I ever got into. Heavy. So I have a real soft spot in my heart for this album, and like I say, I think it still holds up very well, and I think it's still very enjoyable. If you've never listened to this album, I highly recommend it. Um, Now, comparatively, Define the Great Line was released in 2006. Um, it was a major game changer for them as a band. It carried a heavier yet atmospheric sound, which was different than the previous heavier sound on their first three albums, with the pop hooks reduced to choruses for the most part, which I'm not saying they weren't on the choruses on the previous, but there are some songs that I feel like the catchy parts were more at the start of the songs. Singles such as "Writing on the Wall" showed off their drummer's ability to sing, and it led in from a nice kind of melody to a crushingly heavy song that was a perfect example of the aggression mixed with ambience and melody. The vocals on this album were more aggressive, both in the singing and the screaming department, and the more ambient songs such as Salmonarly, however you say that, the song that's like track 6 or 7, uh, it creates a weird kind of atmosphere that leaves a little bit of room to breathe between and almost cuts the album in half, and I think it creates a nice atmosphere that is carried around the entire album in the background of each song. This album was considered a classic by a lot of people I knew during that time within the week it was released. Keep in mind, I was 15 when this came out, so the day I heard it was the day it came out, and I was blown away. Like, this to me wasn't Underoath, but it still was. If that, like, this was an evolution to me. Like, a lot of bands at that time I'd heard that when they changed their sound, I was like, oh, this isn't, I like the old band, but this was them, like, kicking up their game a notch, and it just really, really stuck out, and it put them in even more of a pedestal for me personally with this kind of music, especially considering they're a Christian, which a lot of people I had been going to church with at that time were championing them as the best Christian metal band ever, and this was their best album. I know tons of people that fell in love with this, and much more so than their first one, actually. Like, I know a lot of people that like this one, and they're like, yeah, I didn't like They're Only Chasing Safety. I didn't get into them until after that. And I was like, oh, cool. I really think this album kind of blew open the gates for another thing, and I'm probably going to catch a lot of flack for this, and maybe I'll just do a video on this sometime. I think this is a really influential album on the genre that the more modern poppy metalcore, which I like to call metallic post-hardcore, because to me it's metalcore with more post-hardcore elements. Stuff like Devil Wears Prada, Of Mice and Men, the more electronic influence stuff like Attack Attack, that kind of stuff. I feel like this album kind of kicked that into gear, because I wasn't hearing a lot of that before this. Now, granted, that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't there. It might have been there. I was 15. I didn't have the internet. You know, I don't know. But at that time, after this had came out, I started seeing more bands that kind of had that similar, more aggressive, mixed with the pop element sound like this album. As far as how this album may affected me personally, I fell in love with this album, and it was on constant play, and I still think it, much like They're Only Chasing Safety, really holds up extremely well. The aggression was kicked it up a notch, and it was extremely, extremely enjoyable, and to this day is another favorite of mine. Now we get into the fun stuff. Oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Lost in Sound of Separation. Now, personally, this is where I kind of started to lose interest, and I'm not 100% sure why, but let's talk about the album first before I get into my personal feelings. Musically Lost in the Sound of Separation was, to me, actually a little bit more aggressive than Define the Great Line, with a lot less melodic singing, and while there was melody, I feel like it had less melody to it. Uh, I would actually compare this to the contemporary stuff Norma Jean was putting out at the time. I think it was that level of heaviness um, back in 2008, so that would have been like Anti-Mother and Redeemer for Norma Jean. I would say it's the same type of heavy. Um, I feel like the lyrics and the tone of this album were darker, with the opening track, Breathing in a New Mentality, was really, really, like, there's no clean singing in it at all. It's just kind of kicks you in the teeth from the open, and overall I feel like there's kind of a dark ambience that flows in the background of the song, and it creates almost like a claustrophobic atmosphere that is sort of uncomfortable to listen to, and I think that's on purpose. I feel like, again, this is my opinion, I feel like bleeding through the entire album is this dark undercurrent. I think a lot of that is the personal struggle that the band was going through at the time that's come out in recent years, plus the pressure of having to top Define the Great Line, which I wouldn't want to have to do that. That sounds like an extremely hard album to top. So, yeah, I think that bleeds through the whole thing. The singing that is on this album, as I said, the first track doesn't have any, but the second does. And the singing is rare, but very hit or miss. It's a very weird thing. Certain songs like Any Man Can Dig a Hole, but It Takes a Real Man to Call It Home, I believe it's called, the second track on the album, the singing works there. Fault of Mine, Fault of Mine, whatever I believe the third track, it works on there as well. There's some of the more back-end tracks that works well, but the ones in the middle, his singing just feels like it's being forced, and I don't think that works. Um, Lyrically, as I mentioned, I feel like this is a very dark album. With first and foremost, second chances seems to be a theme in the lyrics, at least to me, like redemption to an extent, but also it seems to be dealing with depression and addiction, which, knowing now what we know about Underoath, that's very possible that that's what some of these songs were about. And that's what I have to say about it as far as the music and lyrics. It's a very heavy and dark album with dark themes, and I actually like this album quite a bit. But unlike the first two, I don't know how this album affected people, because I don't know very many people who talk about this album when they talk about Underoath. I know people who like this album, but I don't know people who, when I say, "Oh, do you like Underoath?" They're like, "Oh, I love Define the Great Line," or "They're only chasing safety." No, most of the people I've met talk about those albums, just not this one, nor the one after it. So I feel like this is kind of actually an underrated album, and I feel like that's hard to deal with, because after everything that they did, no, excuse me, not hard to deal with. I feel like that's hard to, basically what I'm having now is trouble speaking about this album, because I don't really know what to say with it, because I don't know anyone who likes it a lot, and I don't know anyone who names it as an influence that I've met. I mean, there's probably someone out there. If you are, please comment. I'd love to discuss it. But to me, this has always been one of those albums that a lot of the people I've talked to basically see it as Define the Great Line Part 2, the heavier version, and quite a few people I know don't like this album, so that's how a lot of people I've met have talked about this album. So, and a lot of people that I knew that were religious at the time really were down on this album because it doesn't have any faith songs. I mean, I feel the whole thing is about struggling with faith and things that can really weigh you down, like doubt, addiction, and depression. So I think it's more faith-based than they give it any sort of credit for. And as for me, I really like this album. It took a while to grow on me, but the dark atmosphere of this album really, really hits me, and I really like it. So I recommend this one if you like their first two but haven't ever given this one a chance. Now, their final album was Disambiguation. Okay, okay. This is a hard album for me to talk about because let's just try talking about it and see if I can articulate what it is I'm trying to say here. If Lost in Sound of Separation was Define the Great Line Part 2, like a lot of people I've talked to have said, then this is Lost in the Sound of Separation Part 2. It continues in the darker tone with the darker ambient soundscapes, but I feel like it puts them in a much more drawn-out direction with a few peaks of light and hope here and there, under dark waves of ambience that I feel manifests the band's heavily doubting and changing his faith at the time, because around this time I guess some of the members were shedding their faith, from what I've read in interviews. So I think that really comes through in the lyrics. The lyrics are still in a dark vein, with tracks like Paper Lung being really, really haunting. I'm not 100% sure what that song is supposed to be about, but the way I've just listened to the lyrics, I've always interpreted it as basically someone you can't help them and just basically having to turn your back on them for your own sake. And that is a really dark thing to write about, like, especially if it's someone you care about. I love Paper Lung. It's probably my favorite song on this album. This album is another one. I don't know anyone that talks about this album. I'd love to meet people who love this album so they could explain to me why. I don't hate this album by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't know anyone who lists this as an influence when I ask them, like, what albums influenced you as far as this genre of music goes. For me, though, as I said, I don't know anyone who lists this as an influence, but people I have talked to about this album say that they feel this one is samey and boring, to quote a friend of mine. I kind of agree with that, because after the first, like, 3 or 4 tracks, this album kind of fades into the background for me and just becomes kind of, like, it's enjoyable, but it leaves no impression. And I really don't like albums like that, because I've listened to quite a few of them. As I said, I don't hate this album. I don't love it, though, either. It's a very middle-of-the-road kind of album for me. I do find it fading into the background, but when it's on, I enjoy it, even though it fades in the background. But this isn't an album I've ever say I've actually sought out to listen to. I'll just kind of see it sitting on my shelf and be like, oh, I haven't listened to that in 3 or 4 years. I ought to throw that on. So that's my review on these albums. This was more of an open discussion. I just wanted to give my thoughts on them, see what you guys think. Like I said, I think Underoath is a great band. I think they did some great stuff in their time. I haven't been fond of their more recent output, obviously, but I feel like, to wrap up, I feel like Disambiguation, like I said, was sort of a sign of the burnout, because I don't know. I feel like this album was more rehash of Define the Great Line, and I feel like a lot of that was they felt they had to stay in that mold, but I don't know. Like I said, this is just a discussion of my thoughts and feelings on this album, and I'm curious as to what you guys think. If you would like to discuss it, leave a comment, and we can maybe talk about it and see what's what. If you like this video, give it a like, comment, subscribe, share this with your friends, email it to people, use, I don't know, AIM. Does anybody use AIM anymore? Share it on AIM and Google Buzz and, um, you know, Strong Bad Message Board. I don't know. Just share it around and give it a like, subscribe, and have yourselves a great day. Maybe I'll do another discussion video like this. Next week I'm planning on reviewing an album by a band that I have no experience with, who has quite the fan base and legacy, so this is going to be fun. I'm looking forward to getting crucified on this one. And for those of you that have been asking, the Bell's palsy is healing nicely, and I apologize for stuttering and whatnot during this video, because the Bell's palsy does make it somewhat hard to speak, so thank you for bearing with me, and thank you those of you that have been asking me about it and how I've been feeling. Have a great day.